All right, thank you everyone for joining us. This panel is entitled Cops, Courts, and Communities, a Public Safety Agenda for Texas. And as you can see up here on stage, I have the distinct honor of being with three of the most active people in the criminal justice space here in Texas. And since we have the more abridged format, the shorter format today, with only 45 minutes and then 15 minutes for question and answers. I'm not going to belabor the point too much with monologues or introductions. Just going to kind of go through the murderer's row we have up here and delve right into the actual meat and potatoes. First of which, immediately to my left, first time I can say that about James White. James White most recently was the chair of the Texas House Committee on Corrections, which he had been for the previous 2 sessions. Next to him is the Chief Justice of the Texas State Supreme Court, Nathan Hecht. We've all heard his bio this morning, and I don't know if I could add any more superlatives onto that, but we're really glad to have him here with us today. Next to him is Joe Moody, representative from El Paso. He most recently was Speaker Pro Tem, and then prior to that, he was the chair of the Texas Criminal Jurisprudence Committee. And then the man needing no introduction, but I'd be happy to do it anyway, is Senator John Whitmire. John Whitmire has been the chair of the Texas Criminal Justice Committee, including championing basically the massive reforms that went through in 2007 and the large ones ever since. So his stamp on this particular area is notable indeed. And so, again, I apologize for the abbreviated intro, but I want to get right into the discussion. And I'd like to start off with Mr. Chief Justice. Sir, you had written in the Dallas Morning News this past week about the urgent need for bail reform, and that is something that you and Senator Whitmire have been working on for some time. Would you like to discuss that as a topic area?
Sure, happy to. Thanks for the invitation to be here. The pandemic has just made operations in the criminal courts as far as resolving cases very difficult. With respect to continuity of operations, we're doing very well. I think I may have said this morning, we have 3,120 judges in Texas in about 1,100 courtrooms across 254 counties. And we have managed to keep up with filings and processings on everything except jury trials. We had 9,000 jury trials, cases tried to a verdict in 2019. Since March, we've had about 90. So we're about 8,910 cases behind. And about a third of those are misdemeanor cases of less consequence to the system. And about half, not quite half the rest, are civil cases. But there's a substantial number of felony cases that are not being tried, and it's across the state. It's not for want of trying. I think we've tried 3 or 4 felony cases during the pandemic. There are just a lot of problems with trying to make sure that the risk is not increased to jurors and participants. We had 2 cases that were going to go to trial out in College Station, and the defendant in one of the cases turned out to test positive during the first day of trial, and his lawyer subsequently became ill, and there was a risk that he had contaminated the people in the other trial. So it can be done, but it's just always tricky and difficult to do. And we're way behind on that. And the same thing is true throughout the country. It was mentioned earlier that I'm president of the National Conference of Chief Justices this year, and every state is facing the same thing. Nobody is able to do it any better. Everybody is trying. We've tried some virtual jury trials in Texas, but that's really not much of a solution, probably not a solution at all in serious trials, either big civil cases or felony criminal cases. Now, we have been very successful in trying some misdemeanor cases virtually, and there may be, we may be able to make some progress with that. But all of that just puts more pressure on the pretrial release system, and as urgent as it was before, it's even more urgent now. We have there are ways to restructure the pretrial release system, the bail system, to protect the public and not to lock poor people up just because they can't afford it. But we seem to have some trouble getting there, but we're going to continue to work at it because it's very important to us that we do that. And as I put in the Dallas Morning News article the other day, if we don't do it, the federal courts will do it for us, as they already have done in Harris County, Dallas County, Galveston County. And it's just a matter of time before those cases become unavoidable and the system changes. So this is not a, the interesting thing about this issue is it's not political. On the left, a lot of people, a lot of advocates of change view this as compassionate and view it as adherence to the Constitution. On the right, it can be those same issues, but it's also a taxpayer issue. We're just paying a whole lot of money to put people in jail that are no threat to the public. And it's a libertarian issue because why should you lose your liberty under those circumstances? So it really cuts across a lot of different spectrums, and I hope we'll get stronger support.
And that's a very good point, Mr. Chief Justice. I want to draw a strong underline on the thing you said, that it's a two-part issue. It's about, making sure that you're not squandering taxpayer money, but also about protecting public safety. And in in the approach we've seen thus far, Senator Whitmire, your bill specifically, has really used this risk assessment where post O'Donnell, which was the Harris County decision you mentioned, it seems to be more based on the qualifications of indigents, but the risk assessment looking whether or not somebody is actually a threat to the community. Would you like to talk about that, Senator Whitmire?
Yeah, for sure, and thanks for having me this morning. I came partly because I'm with these distinguished panelists. I might learn something.
Sir. Yeah.
First of all, the bail bond system has been broken for some time, and I applaud the Chief Justice for really being an outspoken leader, and his status makes a huge difference. It's broken and has for years kept folks with the same set of facts in jail because they couldn't afford, in Harris County, probably the most egregious of venues I can point out. Simple assault over the weekend with your brother-in-law, backyard fight. You go to court on Monday, $10,000 bond. If you got $1,000, you go back and you're a mechanic at Tommy Von Ford. You make your house payment, you support your family. If you have no $1,000, and I've seen studies, 80% of Americans have no extra funds after they pay their bills. You stay in court. You stay in jail. I, as a young lawyer, have actually been and spoken to these individuals in a holdover cell. He says, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. The guy provoked me. I was defending myself. I said, well, and I'm not going to plead. Let me go talk. I said, let me go talk to the DA. This is 20 years ago. And I'm almost ashamed to admit it publicly, but it emphasizes how broken the system was as a young lawyer in the 80s with my practice and as it is today in 2021, maybe even worse. I talked to the DA and the judge, and they said, well, we'll give him a reset for a month from now. You go back and explain to the same defendant, they said you can come back in March. He said, I'll lose my job. Just go ahead and let me plead. So you have innocent people pleading only because he's got to get back to work. That is so unconscionable, and it's the practice that we're witnessing today. On the other hand, with the cash bond, The risk to the public, the Galveston County Sheriff called me off to the side last year at a Galveston Mardi Gras event. He said, Whitmer, y'all are really on to something. This risk in this cash bond system has to be resolved. We had the largest dope dealer in Galveston County got a $400,000 bond because he is such a risk to society. His boys came down the next year, counted out $40,000. He goes back to work. So you got human traffickers, you got dope dealers, you got some real violent people getting out because they can afford. We must stop that. We've talked about it long enough. Last session we got close but couldn't work out because we ran out of time, but no excuses this time. And this is just one element that we could talk about in the criminal justice system this morning. If you don't remember anything else I say today, leave with this thought. Criminal justice is a system. And any component that's not working right, such as pretrial considerations, breaks down the whole system. James does an outstanding job managing corrections. But if we're not doing it correctly on the front end, he gets the wrong people, and he might not get the right people quick enough. So it's a very much a system, starting out with law enforcement on the streets, which I'm certain we'll discuss. Joe's done an outstanding job of talking about how we waste resources on very small amounts of marijuana. My law enforcement friend said, we don't want to do that, but we haven't successfully changed that statute, and I will close by saying there's a hell of a difference in moving bills in the House versus the Senate. Different dynamics, different leadership, and we've got to keep that in mind. I work in a pretty tough environment, and the Lieutenant Governor has some strong opinions on some of the things that we're going to try to move. So I need all the help I can get, is what I'm saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I need the policy council's help. That's another reason why I'm here today. I need some hard ride help.
Well, we're more than glad to have you here, sir. But I want you hit the nail right on the head about the public safety aspect of this, and I think this is something that commonly gets glossed over, is that, you know, we've had this horrific case with Trooper Damon Allen, you know, being murdered by DeBrett Black, an individual who was in jail or jailed for having assaulted a police officer.
Sure.
Posted the bond, and then went out and killed a police officer.
$1,500 got him out after he beat up a deputy sheriff. But the JP said, hell, I didn't know all that. We need to require him to know all about that.
Yes, sir. And that's I think one of the really good things that we're going to see moving in this session, to your point. And then Representative Moody, you have worked in this space for quite some time, coming up through the ranks of the Criminal Jurisprudence Committee to eventually chair it. So you've seen kind of the procedural element here. Can you kind of give us your take on, bail included, but Senator Whitmire referred to low-level offenses, things like that. Would you like to talk about that?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And I appreciate you inviting me. I'm not sure how I made the cut, given the folks that are up here. And particularly makes me nervous to sit next to someone who, if something is passed in criminal justice reform, it is passed across this gentleman's desk. And so I'm just lucky to get the opportunity to work with him in his shadow. So, look, I think that's the real broad point the senator brought up about the system as a whole. And we think about the different components we work about, right? From first interaction to pretrial, to in-trial, to appellate, you know, to the corrections system, you know, making sure that we don't forget to treat these people like human beings, even if they've been through the system, because we know there's flaws here. But if you're talking about resources and low-level offenses and making sure that we're using, using law enforcement in the best way that we can, it speaks to, you know, what are we doing with our low-grade possession? Most major municipalities and counties have essentially moved away from prosecuting that, and they've gone further than pretrial diversion. They're doing pre-arrest diversion, so that you don't have. Harris County led the way on that, and that was a bipartisan deal in Harris County. They were trying to outflank each other on this issue. and it was a Republican Democrat running for district attorney. And so this is the beauty of the work in the criminal justice arena, is that it's not partisan. And quite honestly, with how divisive things have been lately, I think this is a great arena to work in. This can show people that we can work together. And the notions of mercy and justice and those things that fit so nicely into the criminal justice reform conversation are maybe things we need to think about in politics anyway, and start to figure out how to better work with one another. But that's one component on drug offenses, and we need to expand that up because, Old War Story had a 17-year-old, so adult in the criminal justice system, has a vape pen in school, so he's in a drug-free zone. They do it by it's a concentrate, so now it fits into the felony level. His second-degree felony is his first offense. And I happened to land with a prosecutor that would think, man, this is the worst offense in the world. This is just the way that young people, and I guess I'm 40 now, so the young kids today, that's how they consume cannabis. So that'd be the same as treating some kid with a joint, sending him with a second-degree felony. You got to treat it philosophically the same way. And so we need to address that too, because we have edibles that are getting charged as first-degree and second-degree felonies, and that is not the right way to use those resources. Chairman White, last session, in terms of trying to decrease the amount of law enforcement interaction and pushing people through the system, worked on limiting Class C arrest authority, which apparently was one of the worst things we could have possibly had a conversation about. But quite honestly, you saw that was an incident in Keller recently, right? A man was pulled over for a traffic citation. His father's recording it. The officer goes over there and says, "Well, you're interfering with my public duties by recording it," and then arrests him for what? Still don't know. But all of that amped up because that traffic citation, and because there's a threat of arrest over it. If you remove the threat of arrest from traffic citations, the interaction between law enforcement and the person that they're working with at the roadside is going to be an easier going conversation. If it ramps up from there because of other reasons, that's something else. But that way, as you stop, you know that you didn't have your flasher on or whatever, the threat of arrest isn't there, then the interaction is different. You're on a level playing field, right? And so those are the kinds of things we need to think about. It's not because we don't like cops or we want to make it more dangerous for them to do their job. No, we actually want them to be doing the job that we all think of when we think about law enforcement. So there are better, smarter ways to do this, and it can be done in a way that respects the profession, but also respects people's liberties.
Excellent. Thank you there, Representative Moody. And you actually teed up very well to Chairman White here. Chairman White, your ambit or your policy portfolio is basically everything after the courts. Every single thing that happens after the courts, it kind of falls across your desk as the chair of the House Corrections Committee. I'm just going to ask you this point blank. How has navigating the COVID issue been for our state prison institutions? How has it been? I mean, the Chief Justice spoke a little to how the process was affected. How is it now playing out after the judicial process?
Well, thank you so much for that question, and we definitely want to tell our folks back home that are probably up this morning watching this, we're extremely proud to represent them back in East Texas. And you bring up a good question. It's been a very challenging situation. A lot of members don't know this, but I'm probably on the phone with Director Collier maybe once a day, maybe every other day about this issue. It's been challenging inside these facilities as it's been challenging in our communities. We started with a total population that was right about, well, it was in some instances the largest population, incarcerated population in the country. Obviously, that would, when you compare incarcerated systems, it would impact us most because of the number of folks that we have had involved. So we have had too many of our incarcerated population that have succumbed to COVID-related illnesses and COVID-related deaths. The challenges of getting PPE in, trying to mitigate it has been a very tough issue. But saying that, and I have to say this as well, many of the challenges that Brian Collier had at TDCJ Everybody had. So I have people calling me saying, TDCJ should have had enough PPE. Well, Fauci didn't have enough PPE back in March. Okay, so to say that Brian Collier should have had this solved when the president, the governor, and everyone else didn't have it solved, to me is quite ludicrous. In fact, TDCJ started manufacturing PPE on its own to try to get this out to the incarcerated population and to their staff. They have significantly, since April, ramped up their testing. When you compare, even though Texas has the most incarcerated deaths due to COVID-related illnesses, when you look at some of the metrics and compare that to free world society in Texas, in some instances it's on par or a little lower. But saying that, it has forced our system to look at some other ways to operate, as far as when we get into situations where we have to lock people down, the decreased movement. You can use hot trays to ensure that we can get more hot meals to these men and women as they're being locked down for a variety of reasons. How can we expand technologies, exploit technologies to maintain connection with their family members outside through iPads and other communication devices. And it has highlighted, Derek, the problem that we have with correctional health care and our population. Our population is getting older every year. Obviously, COVID, is very, very hard on our older population. And so, we tell folks we had a challenge with correctional health care before COVID. If COVID ever goes away, and I think it will, we will still have a challenge with that issue of our elderly population and incarceration. So then that brings us to facilities, and it brings us to parole. Of the about 100 facilities that we have, about 12 of them are over 100 years of age. The facility is. Okay, we have a deferred maintenance cost that keeps rising every year. The latest report, $650 million. Of those 12 facilities that are 100 years or older, they represent 1/3 of that $650 million cost. So we have to find a way to go in and deal with this deferred maintenance cost, deal with the significant shortage of correctional officers that we're able to recruit and whatnot. So we have to look at that. And then we have to continue looking at our parole system to make sure that it is maintaining public safety, expressing a level of fidelity to decisions that have been made by local juries in our communities, but at the same time making sure that we're not exacerbating this issue with our older population. So COVID has brought all those issues that were already there to the forefront.
Sir, I really appreciate you bringing up some of the dollars and cents bean counting about this, because I'm just going to put the senator on the spot and then come back to you. So commitments to TDCJ have been down quite precipitous since the beginning of the crisis, both because of the judicial backlog, as the Chief Justice mentioned, and also just because of changes in enforcement patterns and everything else that we've seen from the virus. So we're down, thousands upon thousands of places where we are year over date when it comes to our bed count. Let me ask you, Senator, are we going to be closing prisons this budgetary cycle?
Well, we just mothballed 2, actually, as a result largely of the COVID, which if we start having trials, we might actually reopen. But there's been over 10, I think maybe now 12 in the last 10 years, as a result partly of the reforms in 2007 with more diversion programs, drug and alcohol. We can still do a lot better. I think the census last week was 120,000, down from about 145 thousand before the COVID virus. So, you know, you have to, I can go back to 93 and talk about how it was a revolving door. You know, went in and served about a month for every year, and we all made a commitment that we'd never revisit that if you did the crime, we would know where you would place them. So we're going to continue. James is absolutely right. There's some prisons that should be taken offline. It'd be a cost savings. It'd be good for the correction officers, the inmates, their families, and taxpayers. So I would continue to push in that direction, but we need to make reforms that are feeding the system. And I just want to endorse what Joe said. I mean, it starts really with the involvement of the police officer with the perceived violator. If you go back to Class C misdemeanors that James has worked so diligently on, you know, my vision would be police officers deal with violent situations where you really need a peacemaker. This nonsense of pulling over Sandra Bland because she didn't use her blinker, or the Ambler case here in Williamson County, the chase went to Travis County because he didn't blink his lights. You ought to take time, and we as leaders ought to take time. I've got the book on Class C misdemeanors. You know, if you don't put your parking brake on when a law enforcement pulls you over, Class C misdemeanor if they want to use it. The transportation code, and I could go on and on, it's just nonsense. The degree of government and jeopardizing your liberty over just things that most of us would say don't matter. It's not the best use of law enforcement resources. We ought to free up law enforcement to be called when there is a dangerous situation, not a tool that they like to use. And I've debated it with my law enforcement friends. Oh, but every now and then we'll pull over somebody for not blinking their lights and they've got 200 pounds of marijuana on the back seat. Okay, that might be a benefit, but it doesn't outweigh the waste of your resources, time, and the wrong engagement with people that are having a mental health episode or are not a danger to public. So, you know, there's where I talk about it's a system. It starts with law enforcement. And let me just, for the record, say defunding police is not our most serious point to be discussing. Local communities will deal with that. So I would urge publicly the governor, let's talk about the broken probation system. Let's talk about COVID inside the prisons. One last example of a broken system, and if you don't remember anything I say today, elections matter. In June, I was notified that there were 14,000 inmates approved for parole. Get this, they've served their time to society. They were ready to leave, but they were required by the parole board to complete one more program, a drug or alcohol program or a sex offender program, but those were not being carried out because of the virus. But we came up with a proposal to the governor's office that they could go home and be required to remain in their residence and take a virtual course on drug and alcohol treatment, and it was denied. You know, this is not rocket science stuff. It's dealing with humans like they're your brother, saving taxpayer money, and freeing up those cells that don't need 14,000 parolees in there because they couldn't complete a course when we've got a working alternative. Elections matter, and we need to get back to what the public cares about. The defunding police was the worst messaging on earth, but it will be taken care of by local communities. In fact, most communities will spend more money. And I would suggest if you look at the language in Senate Bill 2, which the majority passed last session, that was the first step in defunding police. We had Republican sheriffs begging us to exempt public safety out of Senate Bill 2, and it was never allowed.
And so, well, since we're on the issue of dollars and cents, Mr. Chief Justice, Representative Moody, one area where you've both have been prolific in your respective fields has been in the area of fines and fees. I'd like to kick that to you, Mr. Chief Justice, and then follow up with a follow-on question for Representative Moody.
Well, again, this is a national problem, a problem in Texas. It came out during the investigation of Ferguson You remember that after the shooting, the Justice Department went to Ferguson to see if a crime had been committed, and they concluded that it had not. But in the course of that, they found that the misdemeanor courts and traffic courts in Missouri were imposing these huge fines and court costs in very low-level offenses. So you run a stop sign or something, and you go in, and the fine's $200, and the court costs are $200, and you can't pay it. And so you go to jail. Most places credit $50 a day or so against your sentence. So you're only in jail for 8 days for running a stop sign. And of course, a lot of times that costs you your job, your family. It causes all sorts of problems. But if you don't go back, if you say, well, I ain't going there because I don't want to be in jail, then of course now you're violating the warrant, and then there's an additional fine for that, an additional court costs. And so people routinely end up owing thousands of dollars to the local government for running a stop sign. I hear that some parents tell their kids, I'm going to have to spank you, but this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you. Well, my dad never said that to me, and nearly as I could tell, it always hurt me a whole lot worse than it hurt him. And the whole point of the system is to punish wrongdoing, or to get it to stop, and not to punish the public as a result. So we've been very successful in Texas getting our justices of the peace to be more flexible, waive fines and fees when they can, and try to be more sensible in doing that. Now, it turned out we needed legislation because the JPs were telling us we would waive this fine or half of it, but we don't have the authority to do that. So we said, okay, well, we think you do, but let's go get that fixed. So we got that fixed. I haven't looked at the numbers in a couple of months because traffic citations have gone to nothing because of the pandemic. They're not handing them out. One of the impacts on the session is going to be the revenue from fines and fees is completely, it's like 10% of what it was last year, or maybe less than that. But anyway, before that, when the system was operating the way it has, the new thing was James would come in and he'd say, how do you please? Well, I ran the stop sign. Say, okay, well, it's $200. Say, I don't have $200, and plus $200 court cost. Well, I don't have $400. And now the JP, instead of saying, you're off to jail, man, he would say, what do you have? Don't you have, all right, let's cut this to $300 and be done with it. I don't know. Well, what about $250? And the defendant says, okay. The judge says, don't you have a family member or somebody to get down here and pay $250, and then you're free to go, and by God, you better not ever do this again. And as a result of that approach, the number of people going to jail went down 15%, and the revenue went up 15%, because the fellow who's frustrated and said, well, you're going to do what you're going to do, put me in jail, is now saying, okay, I shouldn't have done that, but at least I'm out.
That's a very important point, sir. I think that, and this is where I think this is kind of a pretty complex issue that gets misconstrued a lot, is that we're not talking about no punishment, getting off scot-free, but when you have this, again, to Senator Whitmire's point, this system, this one segmented process after another, you have this compounding issue, and the money just keeps adding up, until you get to a point at the end, here's the bill, and it's all or nothing. And unfortunately, so for some people, it's nothing, and that's when we had to basically take someone who's a low-level misdemeanant and actually have them lay it out in jail. And I think that's a very good point, because in that flexibility that was given to the judiciary, they're able to at least walk it into a segment a little bit closer. I remember one of the first things that I've seen in the fines and fees space, where you didn't have to wait for someone to default on that assessment before they were able to enter into some sort of payment plan. Which beforehand it was you essentially had to fail before you could succeed, and now it's you're at risk of failing. How can we set up some sort of environment in which you succeed? And I want to use that to segue to Representative Moody. Representative Moody, again, you've spoken on fines and fees issues many times, but I want to add a little something to what the Chief Justice said. He illustrated that in these collections, a lot of that money goes to the local or district court, as it were, sometimes. How in 2021 and this new administration within the Texas House, do you think that issue will play, and if there's some sort of navigable waterway in which these reforms can continue?
Yeah, I certainly think so. The concept to most people that don't work in the justice arena, when they say, "Oh, well, there's no such thing as debtor's prison," well, that's a very common concept. I know that you can't put people in jail because they're poor, and you go, "Would it shock you that it happens every day? Would it shock you that it happens every day in your hometown?" Even with all these reforms, I mean, we wrote up a bill this session, and I had a colleague say, "Well, I thought that was the law." I said, it's case law, but apparently some people still aren't following this. So we're going to put it in the statute, and we're going to make sure they follow it. And very quietly behind the scenes, people that kind of, I guess, count on that revenue will find ways to critique bills like that. And that's not the answer. I'm not saying to deprive people of revenue. Let's use revenue from the right sources to fund services. When you put it on the backs of folks that are in the system, that creates that issue throughout the whole system. So, yeah, I think it is one of those issues that it is complex, because you have fines and fees and you have court costs and everything else. And then you got your probation fee and all everything that kind of layers on top for anyone that becomes justice involved. But that, just because it's complex doesn't mean that we shouldn't help inform some folks, particularly lawmakers, about the reality that people face out in their communities. They may think that we got rid of the DRP and we passed this bill or that bill, and they say, "Well, we solved it, didn't we?" Well, no, it's still going on, and so we need to remain vigilant on that point, because it's a core principle that we have to be hold fast to. You don't put people in, you don't incarcerate people because they don't have the ability to pay.
Well said, sir. Senator.
Another good example of the subject of the costs impacting probation. We literally have people today choosing going to prison, state jails, in lieu of being placed on probation because they can't afford the probation fees. They can't afford the biweekly drug and alcohol testing. Crazy notion there is, even if you're not involved in a drug or alcohol related offense, you still got to take it. We need to really address the unfairness of that. But because the state funds probation, which is so critical to the system, on the backs of the probationers, one, they're not getting any probationers because the courts are not functioning. So the departments are laying off some really good officers. But more importantly, it is so prohibitively costly that the attorneys and others are advising inmates, defendants, to go to a state jail. You go there for 8 months, you're out. There's no accountability when you get out. And we need to address the state jails because we're getting the wrong people in there. They're not getting the treatment that they need if they were on probation. So there's another prime example of where we're being foolish. And you either pay now or you pay later. And you pay more when those folks choose to go to a state jail or going to prison because, one, we think we've just about ended revoking people for not being able to pay their fees, but I promise you it probably still exists in some jurisdictions. But the state ought to pay the probation officers, who are kind of quasi-state employees. They kind of, it's a mutual package of county and state funds, but the probationers who are on probation for that second or third chance are not choosing it. Can you imagine somebody in their mind saying, oh, I'm not going to choose that opportunity to continue to work, be with my family. I'll go to jail because the prohibitive nature of probation, not only the cost, but the length. We need to have incentives there. If you stay on probation, do everything right for 2, 3, 5 years, for Lord's sake, reward the person and give him that second chance and not have him still having to report to probation. Not to mention the whole second chance. Re-entry, we ought to talk about that sometime. If we'd spend money on helping people come out of prison, get on their feet, we wouldn't see them return in the numbers that they do. So finances of the criminal justice system is a critical subject.
Absolutely, sir. And we're quickly approaching our question and answer period. So I want to vest you all with magical powers in which the separation of power doesn't exist and leadership's everybody's best friend and everything. And I will give you one wish, one policy item in the realm of criminal justice more broadly that you get to pick and choose and it manifests into fruition. What would that be?
Oh
Chairman
gosh,
White?
that sounds like the emergency situation where you got people just doing stuff without separation of powers. Okay.
I was careful to qualify.
We can talk about that.
Right. Oh, wow, that's great. Great question. I think I probably have 2 or 3, but I'll just do one because I know there will be questions and we'll be able to expound. Facilities. I mean, because I think right now that's everything. I mean, if you modernize facilities, as the senator says, you're going to save some taxpayer money. You're going to be able to attract and keep your workforce. You can design your facilities where you needed 100 correctional officers, maybe you only need 75. That dovetails into correctional health care. In that environment, it's security. So as tough an issue as it is, and we talk about it a lot, I think it's facilities.
And I think that you rightfully highlight how that's a cascading issue with the finance, and where a little bit lightning on one column will help another column exponentially. Mr. Chief Justice, same question.
Well, a couple of years ago, I would have said fines and fees, but now I'd say bail because it's wrong. It's easy to fix. The federal courts fixed it 35 years ago, and they're going to fix it for us if we don't fix it. And other states have done it. It's smart for taxpayers. It's rehabilitative. There's just hardly any downside to it. And those that there are can be worked through. So that's what I do.
And certainly better than the status quo.
Yeah.
I think we can all agree. Representative Moody.
That is a challenging question because there's so many big issues. But I'd say the largest, if I got to just wave my wand and do it, would be to abolish the death penalty. There's no larger example of government's power that we've given them than to take someone's life. There are a myriad of problems with that system. They have been proven time and again. They've shown up time and again. There is no way to perfect a system that is you cannot undo that punishment once it is done. And so I don't think we should engage in it. I don't think we should give the authority of the government to do that. They have proven that they have made too many mistakes in that endeavor. I also think that we have to we have to look at it also from a perspective of finding the right meeting place of justice and mercy. Every time I talk about this, and a good friend of mine, a pastor friend of mine that works on this, he said that he gets the question, well, that person, don't you think that person deserves to die? And he said, that's really, he said, you got the wrong question. He said, it's not a question of whether someone deserves to die. It is whether we deserve to kill. And that's the way we need to reframe that debate. It's not an easy issue. That's why I tried to, if you really gave me one that I could wave the wand, that would be the one, because it is extremely complicated and it's a very visceral issue for people.
And I think you highlighted that you tend to see folks active in that space pan-ideologically, because you see such as your colleagues, Representative Leach, jumps to mind as far as engaging on like law of parties issues and things like that, and we see that come up frequently during sessions. So I think that's an interesting conversation to kind of develop, because I think the non-traditional alliances and where people fall, I mean, a lot of that resonates so much to the human core, is that you see people taking stances that you would not if you just were to guess where they would fall.
Yep.
Senator.
The bail bond reform issue can be fixed. I think it's teed up, ready. An area that we don't have time to discuss this morning that is critically broken is the juvenile justice system. In 2007, we had 5,000 youth locked up. They went for stealing a car or being a truant. We passed laws that you have to be a felon. Now we're down to 500 juveniles at 5 rural locations getting very little services. They're dangerous. It's documented that largely the gangs run the places. DAs, juvenile judges will not send youth there because they come back worse. We spent $160,000 per youth. It's a terribly broken system that has to be addressed, and thus far I haven't gotten the leadership to take it serious.
And let me emphasize on that specifically. With that pronounced reduction in population, inherently the measure of central tendency on the criminality of those youth is
Very
now
tough.
far, far higher, because we are committing a more criminal youth to those facilities, which would then, necessitate that those services, when you say services, you mean, intense psychiatric care and the whole 9 yards, be provided, or otherwise you're just essentially, it's a pressure cooker there, and we end up with the results that you
Well,
discussed.
it's a mental health issue. They're not getting in the rural areas the professional help they need.
Yes.
Think about that. That's a population of one junior high. So you have to confine them where, one, you can work with them. When you have them on a 200-acre, multiple building location that was designed as a state school in the 50s, you sent kids there to kind of cool off, get their head straight. Now you're a violent person to go there. Largely, most are armed robbers. The only difference in an armed robber and a capital murder is the gun didn't go off. Sex offenders, and actually a large number of murders. They need to be dealt with seriously, firmly, and see if they can be turned around.
Absolutely.
And you would save money and lives.
I agree wholeheartedly, sir. Well, I don't want to deprive the audience any more time for being able to ask questions. So we have Seth in the back here who will be happy to bring you a microphone, and we'll vector it to the appropriate party here on the panel and give everyone a take. We also have Rafa back there on the other side. Questions? Right here.
I wondered if you guys could kind of readdress that last question in light of political realities. If you had to name the item
Good point.
that you were going to prioritize for this session, considering political realities, what would that be?
Good point.
So he took
the
away your
most
magic
important
wand, I'm
question.
sorry.
Well, he said make-believe world.
I personally think the bail bond issue can be resolved, has to be resolved. It's a bipartisan issue. You pick up the paper every day, and some folks are being released that are a danger to the public. And then we all know, it's documented, that some poor people are being kept there that are not a risk, just simply because they don't have money. So I think the political will there, we're working close with the governor, who has strong opinions. But a lot of what I spoke to, it's very frustrating, will not get addressed, either because of the finances of the state or the lack of willpower, and some instances, lack of understanding. You know, it's been my experience, and I'll even address the leadership of the state, but the rank and file House members, you know, we're here 140 days. The House is elected for 2 years. We're for 4 years. There's a hell of a lot of interest in a lot of subjects. They know a little bit about a whole lot, but not a whole lot about a little bit. So a lot of it's education, forums like this, and we've got our work to go back and try to recruit our colleagues to help us and inform the leadership. But it's a great question. Remember I said a while ago, elections matter? They still do.
Right. And again, I would say facilities. And let me tell you why. UTMB, That's the prison correctional health care for the eastern side of the state. I don't know if you've ever been there, but I have. Elevators don't work. This is University of Texas Medical Branch. It is right adjacent, I think it's connected to the University of Texas Medical School. You've got the Tropical Infectious Disease Institute there, and you have a medical facility, yes, a medical facility that serves the correctional population, but you got a medical facility that looks like a third world building. So it has to be facilities. We have 800, as soon as Brian Collier recruits and trains 800 to 900 correctional officers, you got 800-900 leaving because they're understaffed. It's not a safe environment. Your Attorney General's office in your state is consistently under litigation, okay? This is a test of governance, okay? You have facilities that are more than 100 years old and are costing us more than some other models that we could use. So it's a test of governance. It's a test of making sure that we're using the people's purse efficiently and effectively. So it has to be facilities. If you're a fiscal conservative, it has to be facilities. If you're someone that's concerned about the very fidelity and the professionalism of the doctors that served in UTMB and out in Texas Tech with their on the western side, it has to be the facilities.
Representative Moody, so we're going to take away your wand, but replace it with good vibes.
I appreciate it. I'd say we're going to talk a significant amount about law enforcement interaction in a lot of different ways, and so I think politically realistic to think about Class C authority. My guess is it'll start with the transportation code. At a minimum, we can address that. There are some Class C offenses that there are a handful of them that I could see the argument that you want to maintain the authority to arrest, but those are few and far between. So you start with the transportation code and go from there. I think that's a fairly reasonable one. I think adding, I called it decriminalization in the past, but the way that we worked with it, the governor's office, it became, I guess, de facto decriminalization. It still was housed in the criminal code, but you take low-level possession. I think we can get that done.
And Mr. Chief Justice, the powers are now once again separated.
Let me just say, as an outsider, sitting across the street, the reason that I see a lot of good ideas do not get traction on the other side is that they're presented too abstractly. And it just becomes, the more abstract they are, then people get on a side or the other side, and you never get down to the reality of what's really going on. So for example, with drug courts, when we first had drug courts in the late 90s, everybody said this is a terrible idea, you're being soft on crime, you're never going to straighten these people out. Now, across the country, in Texas, they're a huge success. Veterans courts, a huge success. So if you can prove that it really works, or help bring detail and analysis like I think the TPPF does to the issue so that it's not just whose side are you on, but it really is, can we get this done, then it has more of a chance.
I think that's a really good point, especially when the way things are, hyperbolized so quickly in the way we discuss issues in criminal justice. And like drug courts, if you look at it, it's just it's a way of handling a certain docket, as opposed to this, there's not a building for the normal court and a building for the drug court, or there's not even usually separate rooms. And I think that that's something we should really remember going forward, is that these are complex issues because, as the senator said, this is a very complex system. And so looking at each segment and making sure each segment's firing on all cylinders is definitely something that we can do for the betterment of the state. Other questions? Ma'am.
Yeah, I was really struck, Senator, by your description of the juvenile facilities as being run by gangs. And excuse me if this is sort of conventional wisdom. I'm not familiar with the topic, but you know, it seems to me. I mean, I do wonder what's being done about that to to send kids who are kind of early stage criminals into a place that would be run by more criminality. It just seems really antithetical both to the system and expenses. I mean, they're going to be out in the world committing more crimes. We're paying more money to take them back into prisons, and so I'm just curious what's being done around that.
Well, the real problem is the leadership there will not admit they've got a broken system. It's hard for me to continue to make progress if the director and others say, oh, we've kind of got it under control, until there's an outbreak. You know, the kids take over the facility, which is a routine practice, but I go by the state ombudsman. We have a very effective ombudsman report that visits the 5 sites, and universally they come back. It's got the largest turnover in the state, the largest number of workman comp claims. They just don't come to work, the officers or the employees, because they're afraid of their clients. They do no classification by age or offenses, so they're all mixed together. The real problem is they're in multiple buildings. So when you move about 30 kids from the dorm to the lunchroom or to the athletic facility, they lose control of them. It's a very tough group, and I'm not saying give up on them, but it's certainly more like it should be, in my judgment, and based on the reports, more of a like used as a detention facility more so than a school. To get there, you don't just usually commit your first felony. The courts work with you. And the good news is, though, we've gone from 5,000 down to, it was about 800 before the virus. It's down to about 500 now. This is a very workable group of people that you could control and treat, educate, mental health, et cetera. But you're not going to do it in Giddings or Gainesville or some of these rural areas. They lose complete contact with their families. Most are inner city minority kids. So that's a really broken system that needs the light to be shined on it more so than I can do this morning. And one thing, thank you for your question, that we haven't commented that we ought to at least put on the table, the impact that the COVID virus is having on our ability to do many of the things we're talking about. I think we'll see a somewhat limited session because of social distancing, the difficulty of having witnesses. Most of my success has come not from my knowledge, but from working groups. So the limitation to bring in law enforcement, crime victims, activists to come and let's work out some proposed police improvement is going to be really handicapped by the virus. So we just got to at least realize what our expectations should be. And it's unfortunate because I think the stars are aligned for us to really do some criminal justice reforms, but the damn virus is going to hamper some of our effectiveness.
And let me actually piggyback both off that excellent question and your answer, because I know that one of the solutions you've brought to the table in recent sessions for the juvenile issue specifically has been taking more of a regionalization approach. So it's not necessarily taking a facility from rural Texas and moving it to a major city, but more of breaking down that facility into subordinate components. Can you talk about that really quickly, sir? Because it looks like we're just butting up the time here.
Well, that was largely in the discussion to keep the kids close to their community, that we created regional probation residential facilities so the kids don't. The state model is completely broken, in my judgment, in empirical data. We'll just show you, sending a kid from inner city Houston to Gainesville, he loses contact. They don't even have workers that look like the kids. There's a language barrier for our Hispanic youth. I mean, keep them in their community, and if a small community doesn't have, Harris County's got residential facilities, limited funding, but they do a pretty darn good job of keeping their kids in Harris County residential juvenile facilities. But maybe Lufkin doesn't. So you've got to allow some of our regions to build coalitions or resources for regional treatment for our youth and keep them out of the broken state system, which we've done a great deal of that. But you still got some kids that just can't be kept in the community. They've just flunked every opportunity to keep them peacefully. So they need to be confined in some hard facilities so you can treat them. You can't treat them when they're running loose everywhere and the workers are afraid of them. Get them in a confined, I would move it near Austin somewhere. Hell, I would even compromise and use the Giddings property to build a new facility that is tightly controlled. You could get professional help out of Austin to travel to Giddings, but it's not going to ever work the way it is. And we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're coming out worse than they went. You're talking about, do the gangs control? When somebody's there and unsupervised enough for a penis literally to be tattooed on his forehead, somebody had free time and was being forced to do some really dumb acts.
Well, I see Sarah reaching for the gong mallet here, so I think we're about to get played off the stage. But I want to just thank this outstanding panel that we had. I want to thank all you for attending. I want to thank everybody that's virtually streaming this panel. I think we have a lot to look forward to in this coming session with you gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bill.